The Conservative Party conference was taking place in Brighton in October 1984. The IRA had planted a bomb in the conference hotel, intending to assassinate Margaret Thatcher.
She had been involved in the hunger strike. She had been involved in basically the shoot-to-kill policy. She had been involved in all policies which were, she had the blood of various citizens on her hands. So it is not surprising that more so Margaret Thatcher than anyone else that Republicans wanted rid of.
Mrs. Thatcher survived, but 5 others died.
You hear about these atrocities, these bombs. You don't expect them to happen to you. But life must go on as usual.
She was obviously very, very emotionally affected by what had happened at Brighton. But she saw that again, perhaps in terms of the hunger strike. This was an attack on the democracy that she was sworn to defend. And so her determination was even more obvious to those of us who met her.
If anybody thought that Margaret would crumble or even back off, they were just demonstrating they didn't understand the Prime Minister.
It was a dastardly deed that was done, and they were absolute fools, because you touch an Englishman on a very precious part of his heritage, and at the end he may be very gentlemanly and very nice, but at the end the fire of the English lion will roar, and he'll get his teeth sunk into you.
Obviously, to have narrowly survived and to have seen friends, Conservative friends killed, and the wife of, Norman Tebbutt's wife crippled, that, of course, is bound to have had an impact on her, but it didn't change policy. It didn't change policy.
I think she's a very resolute woman, and it probably just caused her to be a little more resolute, and certainly not to have any degree of affection for the people who had planned, authorised, commissioned that act of terrorism.
And your conference will go on.
The conference will go on. The conference, all right, John, the conference will go on as usual.
Thank you,
Right,
Prime Minister.
thank you.
Many people remember her conduct the morning after the bombing in the Grand Hotel, when she said it's business as usual, and she wasn't going to be intimidated by terrorists, and she was determined to carry on what she thought was right.
Her determination to make her leader's speech within the 24 hours, within less than that, of the IRA bomb that almost killed her, was the personification of that the speech would go on, and she made that speech with no sign of emotional distress, or very little sign of stress.
The nation faces what is probably the most testing crisis of our time. The battle between the extremists and the rest. This government will not weaken.
That was a huge personal blow, and but equally I think the iron entered the soul. I mean, it was remarkable. I was there when that happened, and I mean the determination which she showed to show that, as it were, the British government, the Conservative Party, would not be bowed by terrorism, sent her cabinet ministers who had been in dressing gowns and pyjamas round to Marks and Spencer's to get them dressed up in new suits and shirts. The conference went on, she made her speech. I mean, that showed tremendous courage, but I think equally the hurt. I mean, there was Anthony Berry was killed, Norman Tebbit badly injured, his wife paralysed. I mean, that was something which cut into her deeply. I mean, later on there was the murder of Ian Gow. So, I mean, I think she felt she paid a huge personal price for her stand. But I think for someone like Margaret Thatcher, she always believed that those sacrifices probably were worth making to stand up for the principles that she believed in, that you shouldn't give in to terrorism.
Despite Brighton, A new Irish Prime Minister, Garret FitzGerald, was determined to make Anglo-Irish relations his policy priority and pursued negotiations with Mrs. Thatcher.
The majority has declared itself over and over and over again that there will be no agreement.
The Southern politicians are very persuasive of their, I mean, they put their way well as Irishmen. and I'm sure that she didn't want to have a big battle on that. There were other things pressing in on her. It wasn't a pleasant time that she was having.
Meantime, in Dublin, the Irish nationalist parties, North and South, had come together in the New Ireland Forum. They produced 3 alternatives for Ireland's future.
We have set out ideas which could, we hope, form a basis for common ground between the 2 traditions in this island, and of common action by the 2 governments in these islands, designed to reconcile these 2 traditions.
We would ask them to study the report carefully and with an open mind. Not to do so would, in effect, be rejecting democracy and constitutional politics in Ireland with all that that entails.
I have made it quite clear, and so did Mr. Pryor when he was Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, that a unified Ireland was one solution that is out. A second solution was a confederation of 2 states. That is out. A third solution was joint authority. That is out. That is a derogation from sovereignty. We made that quite clear when the report was published. Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. She is part of the United Kingdom because that is the wish of the majority of her citizens.
I remember watching that interview in which she was asked a question about the proposals of the New Ireland Forum, and she said, oh, well, they proposed such and such a thing, and that's out, and then they proposed something else which was out. And then she couldn't remember the third proposal and had to turn around, and someone reminded her what the third proposal was. Oh, yes, it is, and that is out too. It wasn't strident, and what struck me listening to it was if she couldn't remember what the third proposal was, then they can't have been discussing it. And if they weren't discussing that, they must have been discussing something else.
When she said that, it looked like a slap in the face to me. So I went home, pretty much I did 7 interviews on television, and the worst interviews of my life, because I didn't know what she'd said. The journalists had been there and heard her saying it. I didn't know what she'd said. When I tried to turn on RTE at 6 o'clock before going into the press conference, I couldn't hear them because Lady Caroline blotted them out. The result was I didn't know what she said, the journalists did, and I had to have interviews in total ignorance of what the issue was.
And how did you deal with it?
Badly. It wasn't easy. But then I went home and I thought about it, woke up in the morning and said, well, this is all right. She's now done something which has upset everybody, and her government and civil servants will be trying to bring her around, and we can now use this to get things back on course again. And we get the Americans to intervene. We got Reagan to raise with her the following month, and say he'd like to discuss with her again in February when she came back. And she took the hint, and in January we got new proposals, the whole thing started again.
J.J. Farrell, the Boston Globe, a big biography of Speaker Tip O'Neill, the great Irish-American politician of his generation. And essentially what this shows is that the State Department, which was upset by the Speaker's criticism of US policy in Latin America, basically said, we've got to do something to buy Tip off. He wants movement on Ireland in an Irish nationalist direction. The type of Dublin is talking about, the model we now know is the agreement of 1985. So they went to the president and they said to Ronald Reagan, look, the way of calming Tip down is to give him what he wants on Ireland. And there is no question that this was understood and was part of the dialogue behind the scenes. And there's absolutely no doubt that the Reagan dimension and being in Ronnie's good books was part of the reason why she did it, by the way.
I had come to the conclusion pretty early on that the British establishment, as opposed to the British political establishment, had already decided on where it was going. That, in effect, ultimately, they were not going to remain in Northern Ireland. They wanted a safe landing for that, of course, They weren't going to do it without consent, as defined subsequently in the Good Friday Agreement, but that the British establishment mind had worked through analysis towards a position that it was going to ease their way out of Northern Ireland.
What was going on was that we now know that they had started the discussions on what eventually then became the Anglo-Irish Agreement in 1985.
And was she trying to hide that in some way?
Oh, at the end, yes. When it was fairly clear that something was happening and there were pretty broad leaks appearing in the press, the Unionist elected representatives were being told, oh no, this isn't happening, there's nothing happening here. Now, they were being told whether it was because the people they were speaking to made a mistake or whether the people they were speaking to were deliberately feeding them with this information, I do not know. But it is the case that the Unionist MPs at Westminster didn't actually pick up what was going on.
I know that at that time that she was involved in talks with Molyneux and Paisley around the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and I do believe that if they had more of an input, probably more of a courageous leadership and used their leadership in a positive sense, that we probably wouldn't have continued along the road until many, many years later.
There was a lost opportunity there. Whether a robust warning about the dangers of going down this path would have deflected, I do not know, because once Margaret had the bit between her teeth, she was notoriously obstinate. So, but whether that could, if they had been coming in more timely, whether that could have happened. The consequence of the Anglo-Irish Agreement is, of course, we lost all hope of political progress for several years. And it wasn't until on a slightly different atmosphere in the early 1990s that it was possible to get any sort of political engagements.
There were wise voices within the government, people like Willie Whitelaw, people like Jim Pryor. I mean, to a certain extent, they were of a generation, I think, who believed that, you could have the public side, you could have the strong stance against terrorism and not to be seen actually to be negotiating. But I think equally they did feel that, in the end, Ireland had to be dealt with as the island of Ireland, that you had to involve the Republic.
It came from a feeling and a sense in the past that if you ever, there was no possibility of progress, that if you had discussion that there were people who was no surrender, not an inch on anything, and one knows the famous Paisley war cry in that respect, and that in the end what you had to do was decide what you were going to do and then do it, and then face up to the way it went.
How did you think she felt after signing that agreement in Hillsborough?
Unhappy, uncomfortable, clearly. Ian Gow's resignation obviously bothered her greatly. I can see that in talking to her.
Mm-hmm.
One of the amusing parts was that our two teams prepared a catechism for us of 59 questions to put to us so that we both give the same answers and not have a difference of emphasis might cause problems. And so when we sat down beforehand, she said to Dermot Nelly, now you ask me some questions, Dermot, and Robert will ask Gareth some questions. And we went through a kind of an inquisition this way, we'd learned to offer answers properly.
And did she stick to them?
Oh yeah. She did, of course.
I think what she hadn't anticipated was the reaction. You remember there was an outburst by Enoch Powell, who called her a traitor in the House of Commons after the announcements were made. And actually on the day of the signing, I remember very well that she was very concerned because she arrived at Hillsborough. And immediately, before we had a further meeting, she went up to a private room to speak on the telephone to Ian Gow, who'd been her PPS and her most loyal supporter, who resigned over it.
We went upstairs afterwards and somebody gave us each a glass of champagne, and I said, Margaret, of course our ambassadors are going into co-repair in Brussels to organise a large amount of money for Northern Ireland on Tuesday, whatever, the following week. And she said, what? As you didn't know about it. She must have known about it. Oh, no, more money for these people, she said. Look at their schools, look at their roads. I need it for my people. She wasn't much of a unionist. I mean, our sympathies lay with unionists, certainly more than nationalists. But in fact, she was a very English person who had no particular draw for our affection for Northern Ireland, I'd say.
There's a great story about this that Sir David Goodall tells, that and Sir David Goodall was in the Cabinet Office and one of the officials who directed her towards the Anglo-Irish Agreement. And he said to her, look, Margaret, you have to understand one of the things about Ireland and England is that it's a complicated relationship and in some ways we're all mixed up together. And she said, well, I really don't get that, she said. I'm completely English. I'm completely English. And then she stopped and she said, but there was great-grandmother Sullivan. And so even Margaret Thatcher had this kind of, you know, trace of an Irish background.
Was it enough? Clearly it wasn't. You know, Republicans want United Ireland. They want it for not just romantic reasons, they want it because they believe that is the best way to guarantee the rights of people in that.
Loyalism and unionism seen her as the greatest betrayer, you know, since the partition of the state. And it was, she wasn't the most British Prime Minister, she wasn't defending the Union, she was now going to sell us all out, so loyalism then felt betrayed by her.
And yet Mrs. Thatcher tells us that that republic must have some say in our province. We say never, 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 never.
I was an Ulster man and I saw my country going down and down and down, and the people that I should have been able to look to give me help and succour were destroying me, and it was hard to take.
It was a much better agreement for unionists than the unionist politicians at that time were prepared to recognise. And I think there aren't many of them now reflecting on it who realise that actually with a proper understanding that the Irish government, for the first time in its history, was accepting that Northern Ireland would remain part of the United Kingdom in perpetuity if that was what the majority of people in Northern Ireland wanted. And that was called the principle of consent. I think about the only people left who still don't accept that are Sinn Féin.
It brought home to unionists the limits of their bargaining power. And while I also believe it delayed developments within unionism because there was such a profound sense of shock and was negative in many of its impact on the unionist community, still not gone. Nonetheless, it did have that effect.
Actually, the Ulster unionists, if they played it a different way, could have made my life more difficult if they'd said, well, we won. We won the principle of consent. We've got the acceptance of the Irish government that the majority of people in Northern Ireland will determine the future of Northern Ireland and they would have had the confidence to say, and that will maintain their allegiance to the United Kingdom. But however, they decided to go the other way, which was unfortunate.
Our worry had been violence, not demonstrations. And the demonstrations may even have been partly organised to move people away from violence, to give them something else to focus on. And so we didn't have the problems of violence. We had indeed strengthened our army for the purpose, the British done the same, and we didn't have that violence, in fact. So maybe the demonstrations were useful in that way. They had a double effect. They certainly encouraged nationalists to be in favour of the agreement.
It's the one thing in her memoirs where she comes to the point of almost admitting a mistake. And if you read the last paragraph, couple of sentences of her chapter on Northern Ireland, which includes the Anglo-Irish Agreement, she says that we did not get the results we'd been led to believe would come from it.